So, how does a single post on social media end up threatening the entire world's energy supply and kicking off a global crisis? Well, that's exactly the question we're looking at today with the naval blockade that's just been declared in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the planet. Let's get into how this all happened and, more importantly, what it means for all of us. And this is it. This is the announcement that put the entire world on edge. On April 12th, the US president declared a full-on blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And that move? It sent instant shockwaves through international markets and, every diplomatic channel you can think of. But behind that really broad language, what was the actual plan on the ground? To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to look past that initial sweeping statement and dig into the official military plan that came out right after. And when you do that, you see a really critical difference. Okay, so this is where you can really see the gap between political talk and military reality. The president's post made it sound like a total shutdown of the strait. But then, U.S. Central Command, that CENTCOM, they quickly clarified things. The official plan wasn't to blockade the entire waterway, but it was a much more targeted action against ships heading to or from Iranian ports. Now, that's a huge distinction, but let's be clear, it's still a massive, massive escalation. And they were not wasting any time. CENTCOM announced the blockade would start the very next day, April 13th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That set a really hard deadline for this whole new, very tense phase of the conflict. So, the big question is, how did we get to this point? I mean, a sudden blockade like this doesn't just happen out of the blue. To understand the why, you really have to look at the last few weeks of rising tensions and, ultimately, a major breakdown in diplomacy. The road to this blockade was just paved with one thing after another. The situation was getting worse and worse, starting with these allegations that Iran was planting mines in the super important sea lane. And not just that, but that they were charging ships a $2 million toll, basically, just to pass through safely. The U.S. response was to send in missile destroyers to start clearing those mines. And the last hope? Peace talks in Islamabad. They completely collapsed. That left military action looking like the only path forward. And the U.S. position was made crystal clear. The president's language was incredibly blunt, right? It left zero room for misinterpretation. The mission wasn't just to set up a blockade, it was to actively clear out those Iranian mines and respond to any kind of hostility with just overwhelming force. And these are the ships right there on the front line. The USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy. They're two advanced missile destroyers, and they were given the task of that mine-clearing operation, putting them in a direct confrontation with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps right there in the strait. Now, this is so important to understand. This is not just a regional conflict. The Strait of Hormuz is what's known as a global choke point. When you squeeze it, the effects are immediate, they're tangible, and they're felt by the entire world. The impact was instantaneous. As of April 12th, you already had 800 commercial ships just stranded in the strait. Think about that. That's 800 floating warehouses full of goods, raw materials, and energy, all of a sudden just stuck, unable to move. And if you dig into that number a little bit, the energy impact becomes really stark. Almost half of those stranded ships, we're talking nearly 400 of them, are oil tankers. That is a huge chunk of the world's daily oil supply, suddenly at a complete standstill. This quote from the Emirati Minister of Industry, Sultan Al Jaber, it just perfectly captures what's at stake. He calls the strait a global economic lifeline. Its disruption isn't just an economic issue. He says it's a direct threat to the energy, the food, and even the health security for countries all over the globe. And here's how that huge global problem starts to hit you at home. Since this whole conflict really started heating up in late February, the average price for a gallon of gas in the US has shot up by more than $1. It draws a straight line from a crisis in the Middle East right to your wallet. But if you look at it from the Iranian perspective, this was only the beginning. The Speaker of Iran's parliament sent out this really chilling warning. He's basically promising that this blockade is going to make today's high gas prices look cheap in comparison. So, as you can probably imagine, a move this big and this bold triggered a sharply divided political response, both here in the US and around the world. In the US, you had strong support from allies like Senator Lindsey Graham. He framed this whole thing as a necessary step to take back control of international waters and really confront Iran. But the opposition was just as intense. Senator Chuck Schumer had this really blunt take, basically painting the decision as totally reckless and poorly thought out. Iran's official response was pretty clear and direct. They came out and said that any U.S. military vessels approaching the strait would be seen as a violation of the ceasefire. They were drawing a very clear red line in the water. But look, to really truly understand this crisis, we have to look at the one issue that's just casting a shadow over everything else, and that's the unresolved question of Iran's nuclear program. This, right here, is why diplomacy failed. After 21 hours of negotiating, the talks in Islamabad just completely broke down over this one single crucial point. The U.S. wanted a long-term fundamental promise from Iran that it would not build a nuclear weapon. And U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance really laid out the American position. He said that the U.S. just hasn't seen that fundamental commitment of will from Tehran that they were looking for. And that just left the two sides at a complete and total stalemate. And this data from the International Atomic Energy Agency really shows you why the U.S. is so concerned. According to the nuclear watchdog, Iran has enriched enough uranium to be 95% of the way to weapons-grade material. Their stockpile is big enough to build an estimated 10 nuclear bombs. This is the ticking clock in the background of this entire crisis. So this all leads back to one huge, overarching question. You have hundreds of ships stranded, energy markets in total chaos, and the shadow of a nuclear-armed Iran just looming over every single decision. This is so much more than a naval blockade. It's a high-stakes showdown over one of the most vital waterways in the world. And it forces all of us to ask, what is the ultimate price of control?